Introduce myself for those that weren't here yesterday. My name is Graham Robertson. I am a professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I direct something called the Authoritarian Politics Lab at UNC, which is a group of researchers, mostly doctoral students, and postdocs working on problems of authoritarianism, on the psychology of authoritarianism, and on opposition to authoritarian dictators around the world. A lot of focus on Russia. There's a dictator in Russia, I don't know if you've heard of him. You know? A lot of focus on Turkey, a lot of focus on China. But also looking at the problem of growing authoritarianism around the world. And we attract students from those countries and also from all over the world to work with us on that. My own background is as a political scientist, working on social movements, on revolutions, and increasingly in recent years on political psychology. And what I'm going to present this morning is kind of within that sort of political psychology sort of a realm. I have been coming to Kyiv, so the first time I came to Kyiv was 1995. I've been coming on and off over the years ever since. And really since 2012, working closely with Ukrainian collaborators on survey research. I've been doing surveys on close to an annual basis since 2012, usually with Mikhailo Mishenko at Razumkov, but also with other collaborators. Some of this work that I'm going to present this morning, we worked with Olga Onuch from the University of Manchester in England. She's a Ukrainian and helped to manage some of the questions. The work I'm going to present today is, it's about identity, and it's about the relationship between identity in Ukraine and war. It's about the relationship between personal losses in the conflict since 2014. And so we ask questions about whether people have lost friends and family, et cetera, in the war, and so I just want you to be aware that that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. It's survey questions, so it's quantitative evidence, and but just to be aware that that's what we're going to be doing. So this talk is about attitudes and ideas in motion, and really the idea is to look at the formation, the evolution of people's national identity, people's ethnic identity, people's linguistic practices in Ukraine over time. And one of the really fascinating, one of the really exciting things about working in Ukraine over the last decade or so has been the extraordinary evolution, the dynamic nature of identities in Ukraine over that period of time. I don't need to tell you guys that. You guys know that better than I do. But I have some data that I hope you'll find interesting and thought-provoking as we go through. The research that I'm going to present is brand new. The ink is still wet on all of it. I presented it for the first time at the American Political Science Association conference 2 weekends ago. In Los Angeles. That was the first time that the paper got written on, like, the Friday before. So it's super fresh, and so it's going to be a little bit rough in terms of theorization, perhaps, and then maybe in terms of some of the interpretation. And so I'm extra excited to be able to present this here and with this audience where I can get feedback on what's in here. Tell me where I'm doing wrong. Tell me where our understandings are off, and correct us before we go out into a broader, meaner world, right? So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I really look forward to feedback. And then also there was a couple of articles that I suggested for people to read perhaps before the talk today, and I'm happy to discuss those with you as well when we're finished. I hope to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we can get into a conversation. Okay, so enough prologue. I'm going to talk about national identity, nationalism, national feelings. And so it's always worthwhile, I think, to just sort of back up a little bit and think about the theory of nationalism and put this in a broader context. We're going to focus in on Ukraine in a moment, but it's worthwhile to sort of think about the broader international comparative context. And what we see is that a couple of things that are really striking. One is that for most people, they think of national identity, they think of their nationhood as something old, right? Of something that connects them deeply with the past, right? And you go back to history, you go back 1,000 years, and you point to Kiev, or you point to, I'm actually Scottish, and so my people always go back to something called the Declaration of Arbroath, which is a small fishing village in 12th century where a bunch of people got together and made a statement, right? They asked the Pope to recognize them. So people think of these as being really, these national feelings as being really historic and deep. And in actual fact, it's pretty new that people think of themselves in these sort of national terms. And when you ask somebody what their nationality is, that's a meaningful question, but it's only been a meaningful question for most people in the last couple of hundred years. It really starts to be a big deal after the French Revolution. So before the French Revolution, before the modern era, the nation is a term that was used. You find it in documents, you find it in the Declaration of Arbroath from the 12th century. But the meaning of that term is the propertied classes. The meaning of that term is essentially the monarch and the nobility, the landowners. They're the nation. Why? Because they're the decision makers, right? And everybody else, the unwashed masses, people like me, maybe like you, are excluded from the nation. And it's only with the French Revolution that the idea of extending the polity and consequently the nation to all citizens becomes a reality. It becomes something that people start to think about. And so the French Revolution sets a fire under thinking in Europe and thinking around the world, ultimately, about people's primary set of identifications. Before then, most people would identify with a religion. You ask people, what are you? They would say Orthodox, or they would say Catholic, right? Or you ask them, where are you from? They would say, from here. I'm a local. Or they might talk about their city or their region. It's only after the 19th century, or in the 19th century, that people across Europe and then increasingly around the world start to say things like, I'm French, or I'm German, I'm English, those kinds of terms. And there's a debate in the literature, in sociology, and to a certain extent in political science, although much less in political science, about what's happening in that process in the 19th century. For some people, what happens in the 19th century is a kind of a return to an eternal past, right? A removal of imperial domination, and the emergence instead of a reconnecting with some deep history of cultural, linguistic, ethnic, religious, symbolic practices that have been around forever, right? So when the Austro-Hungarian Empire starts to fall apart and it breaks up into different nations in Central Europe, the claim amongst most of the nationalists at the time is we're connecting with our past. And so we're going to develop our language, we'll develop a high culture, we'll develop a written language, a written literature in our own idiom that reflects long-standing practices, right? We're resurrecting the past, we're reconnecting with something that exists before the creation of empires. This process is one of deep connection. It's also one of relatively rigid boundaries. It's one in which people are defined by things that are pretty hard to change, like religion, like language, and that are pretty constant over time, right? And so that's sort of in the literature they call this the primordialist understanding of the nation, right? It's a primordial, it's a fundamental, it's a basic element that in the 18th and 19th century politics allows us to access again, right? That's the sort of one set of perspectives on this process of the emergence of nations. Another perspective on this is rather the opposite, and it's what we call constructivist understandings of the nation. And this is a recognition that the nation is nothing more than a set of ideas, than a set of beliefs that we have that are created by humans, that can change over time, that can be created, that can be destroyed. And it's really just about not that we are actually connecting with some deep linguistic, ethnic, cultural practices from the past, but that we believe that we are connecting with these deep linguistic, cultural connections with the past, right? Whether they're true or not doesn't matter. Whether it's true that there was, a Scottish nation in 1200, spoiler, it's not true. But if it were true, that's, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. What matters is the here and now. What matters is how we think of it now and how we understand our relationships with each other and our relationships, very importantly, with political power with the state, right? And that's that's what we call the constructivist sense of nations. And you'll see in those two different perspectives, one is a static perspective and the other is a much more fluid perspective, a perspective that allows for dynamism. I talked yesterday about tradition versus the Enlightenment, about traditional ideas of the state sort of reflecting sort of what people deserve versus the state being something that people can create, something people can change, right? This is a sort of a reflection of that kind of distinction, right? A distinction between a fixed world and a world of possibility, right? A world of change. In political science, the idea of constructivism is much more powerful, much more popular than primordialism. There's a sense, a strong sense within political science that actually the real story here is construction. And so there's a lot of different perspectives on what kind of construction we're talking about. So to go back to the French Revolution, the idea of the nation that emerged from the French Revolution is very much what I think of as being a voluntarist notion. The nation is something that's constructed out of what people want, right? So for Montesquieu, this is this idea of the general will, right? The idea that there is some kind of shared common perspective, some kind of shared common desires out there in the world to create a political entity, right? And that's where nations come from, this general will. For Ernst Renan, who I also talked about yesterday, a philosopher of the French Revolution, the nation is what he calls a daily plebiscite. Right? This is the most radical perspective. A plebiscite is a referendum, a vote, right? And so for Renan, the nation only exists to the extent that people actually want it from day to day. So it's very, very fluid, and it's about a voluntary opting in. You get to be American, French, German, because you choose to be American, French, or German, not because your parents were American, French, or German, or Ukrainian. but you opt into those communities, right? This is a fairly radical perspective on where nations come from, right? And much more, if you think about it, the contrast between this and a sort of, well, for 1,000 years we've lived on this land and we've spoken this language and we've worshipped this God, right? This is a totally different perspective. Right? There are also other views within the, and I would say probably more popular views within social science on constructivism that are less voluntaristic, less ad hoc than the approach of Renan. So one of the most influential thinkers in this regard is Ernst Gellner, who's a sociologist, was a sociologist. And Gellner's idea was that actually nations are constructed out of economic necessity. They're really, the fact that nation building happens primarily in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, is not a coincidence. It's because what else was going on in the late 18th, early 19th century? The emergence of capitalism. And so capitalism and nationhood go together. Why? Well, what happens with capitalism, you get the construction of factories, right? Peasants move from the countryside where they would have lived in relatively small communities, interacting pretty much only with each other, and occasionally, on market days, going to the market, maybe in a nearby town or city. For that, you only need a certain amount of very local communication, right? You can have your little local language, you can have your own local customs, and those languages and customs could be totally incomprehensible to somebody from 10 villages over, and it didn't matter. With capitalism, what happens is all of a sudden, you're bringing all these people into the city, and you're putting them in a factory, and you're giving them instructions. You do this, your job is to put the wheels on the trolley. Your job is to kind of put the bolts in. Your job is to make the bolts. We need to coordinate all of this stuff for mass production. And once you're in the business of coordinating all of this stuff for mass production, then the demands on people to understand each other and to share some sense of common identity is much larger. And so you get this sort of production of what Gellner calls a high culture, but what we really think of as a written language and a standardized spoken language, what some people would call received pronunciation. So there's an official way to speak English or Ukrainian, and if you don't speak it that way, then you have a funny accent, right, where there's a sort of standard accent. And then you bring people from all over the country, all over a territory, and you teach them how to speak that way, and you teach them how to write that way. And that becomes what it means to speak French. There's a wonderful book by a French sociologist called Eugene Weber called Peasants into Frenchmen. And it sort of recounts the story of how the French state was created in order to educate and normalize and standardize what it means to be French. And that's and it's all really a product of the demands of industrial capitalism. And so that's the sort of the driving force behind this process of nation building, and then it gets copied in other places around the world, right? So it's fundamentally, in the Gellnerian sense, an economically driven process, right? A third perspective on this is associated with a sociologist called Leah Greenfeld. And for Greenfeld, her perspective is different. She actually dates the emergence of nations a couple of hundred years earlier than Gellner does. And she sees it as primarily a state-driven process. So not a process driven by capitalism, by economics, but a process driven by the state, by state building and the needs of state building. She locates the emergence of the nation in England, and she locates it with a king called Henry VIII. Henry VIII, as every British school kid gets told, had lots of wives, and 6, in fact. And he was originally married to a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, who was actually his brother's widow. And after his brother died, he's forced by kind of convention to marry Catherine. But he doesn't like Catherine very much, and he has his eye on a young woman at court called Anne Boleyn, right? And so Henry has a problem. He has to try and somehow divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. And so he asks the Pope to sort that out for him. And the Pope plays hard to get and says no. The Pope is under enormous pressure from the Spanish crown, which is a much bigger player, a much more important country at this point in history than England is. So he tells Henry, sorry, mate, you got to stick with Catherine. So Henry, very disgruntled, decides, okay, well, I'm going to leave the Catholic Church then. I'm going to create my own church so that I can create my own, dissolve my first marriage myself and get on with what I really want to be doing in life, right? And so he creates the Church of England. And this is the first church that breaks off from the Catholic Church in Western Europe and leads ultimately as part of what becomes the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation is one story that emerges from this. But for us, the story is of national construction. This is the beginning of the need of the state to create a different identity, to stop people located in that place that we now call England from being allied, from owing fealty and loyalty to the Pope, and instead to move that fealty and loyalty to the English crown. And importantly, to start paying taxes to the English crown, to not pay taxes to the Pope, to essentially nationalize, privatize all the monasteries in England and all the enormous wealth that they had. Instead of that belonging to the Pope, it now belongs to the English king, right? And that model occurs to other kings around Europe as being, hey, that worked pretty well. Look how rich Henry got from essentially separating the power of the state from the power of the church. And that process spreads through Europe over time, right? So that's a kind of a state-driven understanding of where nations come from. So these are sort of interesting. There's the French Revolutionary idea, which is very much a bottom-up approach, right? Individuals deciding based on their own voluntaristic perspectives on which identity is for them. And then these other two perspectives are deeply structural or deeply political, right? With authorities of either economic authorities or political authorities driving the process of standardization. So that's sort of a sort of quick and dirty perspective on some of these different views. And I think what we're going to see in at least the perspective that I'm going to present this morning in Ukraine over the last 10 years, we have a combination of both of those, of two of those things going on. We have a combination of the voluntaristic perspective, where people are choosing to change their identities, to change their practices based upon their own decisions. But in those own decisions, the behavior of states matters a lot. All right. So this is where we get into connecting up the states and nation building. One of the sort of associated literatures that we bring in the paper and just in my general thinking about nation building is a large literature on state building. And a very prominent argument made by American sociologist Charles Tilly, one of the real founders of 21st century sociology, is the idea of states and war making as being basically fundamentally a similar process, right? That what you see historically is you get the emergence of fairly large states like France and Germany, ultimately Great Britain, Spain, and smaller states too, like the Netherlands and Belgium, essentially out of the demands of international conflict. It's the fighting between princes that selects which princes are most effective in battle, and so get stronger, and so get more territory. This is a story really of how Prussia sort of grows to encompass most of Germany. It's a story of how Wessex grows to become England, essentially, by conquering all of the neighboring kingdoms around it. And as that process of coercion, of violence, of conquest takes place, in order to fund that process, states need to develop militaries. They need to get their militaries bigger and better and more efficient. So they need to raise taxes. So they become better at raising taxes, at extracting resources from cities, from the countryside, from peasants. Once they get better at raising resources, they then get better at fighting wars because they use those resources to build up more military capacity, which allows them to conquer more territory, which allows them to have more people to tax, which allows them to expand their administrative apparatus for taxation, which allows them to expand their army, and so on and so forth in this kind of a circle, right? And so what you see in Europe over the course of the early modern period is the consolidation of states through this process of coercion, taxation, and the growth of administrative and military capacity, right? Those processes go hand in hand, and they sort of culminate in this. This map is a map of the boundaries of Europe in 1648 at the Treaty of Westphalia. Treaty of Westphalia is the treaty that ends the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War is this crazy, tumultuous period of violence all across Central Europe, enormous violence all across Central Europe, particularly in Germany, the Netherlands, and it produces dozens and dozens of different conflicts, but at the end of the day, it produces this big treaty which starts to mark clearly the boundaries of what are now the states that we see on the European map. It starts to mark clearly the boundary of France. It creates an entirely new country called Switzerland. It takes an entirely new country called the United Netherlands, the United Provinces, right, which becomes what we know today as the Netherlands. It still leaves Germany divided up into lots and lots of different kingdoms and principalities. But it starts the pressure on those principalities to merge. And Prussia, in particular, starts to emerge as the most powerful of those principalities, in part because of pressure from France, right? They're building up for conflict with France over the territories to the east, and so the pressure on the German princes to ally, to pool resources in order to survive is what gives you ultimately both German unification and Italian unification. So it's this pressure of war that gives us the state system that we see in Europe today. So the growth of war, the growth of capacity to fight, the fact that it gets more and more expensive over time to fight as military technology gets more sophisticated, makes you need a bigger tax base and makes you need to be more efficient at raising taxes. And so there's this kind of circular relationship, and that's what gives us the system of international relations today. The Treaty of Westphalia, as many of you will know, is seen as the sort of fundamental building block of international relations. International relations, as we know it today, begins traditionally in 1648, right? We still talk about the Westphalian system as being what drives international relations. So the key part of this is about war, right? War is making states. And so the question that we ask in this research is to what extent, okay, war makes states, that's pretty well established. It's true in Europe. There's also evidence that's true in Latin America. What about nations? What's the relationship before? So we already know that states have a role in creating nations from Greenfeld, and we know that war makes states. So what's the relationship between war and nations? Right. That's sort of the the broader research question that we're going to engage in this morning. Right, so this is the question more specifically in the context of Ukraine is to look at how experience of war over the last 8 years, 9 years, has shaped nationhood and national feeling in this country. Now, a few things that we know from other research. We have learned, as I mentioned yesterday, I personally have learned an enormous amount from Ukrainians on this subject, and would never be able to do any of this work without the support and assistance and advice and criticism often of lots of Ukrainians. And there's a really good literature on the evolution of Ukrainian identity since the Revolution of Dignity, right, since 2014, both during the Revolution of Dignity actually, and then since. And so one of the pieces I asked you to read or offer up for reading is something that I wrote with some colleagues, looking at how the very experience of protesting itself, the experience of participation in the Maidan, was consequential, not so much for people's national identity per se, but consequential for how they thought about that identity and some of the consequences of that identity. Particularly, participation in the Maidan helps to crystallize in people's minds that the relationship between Ukraine and Europe and the relationship between Ukraine and Russia were mutually exclusive. The idea that you could have very close relations, close trade relations, specifically with Europe, and close trade relations with Russia, which as an empirical matter is not true because of the nature of the treaties and the nature of the trade regulations that are involved. That became much clearer to people who were participating in the protests, in part because they were learning a lot during the process of participation. Maidan, as I mentioned yesterday, and as you guys all know better than I do, is not just a protest, it's like a seminar, right? It's an ongoing learning experience. It's also a huge community building exercise. There are people, from all over Ukraine, from lots of different perspectives, getting together and working together for the cause, right? And so it has this extraordinary effect on participation. Participation has a big effect on people's understandings. One of the things that starts to emerge from the Maidan, and from the Maidan being kind of a touchstone in people's political history, people's political evolution, is that you start to get a change in understandings of Ukrainian identity, moving from being an ethnic or a linguistic project to being also a political project, right? So the political construction of Ukraine as a state that's oriented towards Western Europe and the EU, rather than oriented towards Russia, becomes much more part of what it means to be patriotic, what it means to be Ukrainian as a result of the Maidan. And there's a lot of evidence from Ukrainian scholars around that argument. And then finally, you can't see this at the bottom, maybe because I'm sitting right in front of it, but there's also research by Volodymyr Kulik and others in Ukraine about the process of what Kulik calls the shedding of Russianness. That was one of the articles I offered people to read. And so this is a sort of gradual process of Russian being spoken less, or different choices being made about how to understand where people's language preferences come from and people's language use, but also a process in which the speaking of Russian is not seen as being sort of anti-Ukrainian or non-Ukrainian, right? It's also part of a Ukrainian identity. And so changing understandings of that whole relationship between language and in some sense, a decentering of language from identity in the post-Maidan era. So there's been lots and lots of work around the Maidan and what happened afterwards. We're focusing in on a narrower set of issues, a narrower question, and looking not at the protest experience of the Maidan and not at the sort of broader societal effects of the revolution and its consequences, but instead at the very specific experience of war and what war has done or not done to attitudes and identities in Ukraine, and very particularly individual experiences of losses from the war. Right, that's what we're going to focus in on. And there's some already existing literature about, based in Ukraine, about experiences of violence. The Lupum Pesyakin piece is really not, as I'll talk more about it in a second, it's not about the events of the post-communist period at all. It's actually earlier. Sasa and Lackner, two German researchers, have some interesting work on attitudes in the occupied territories, in the occupied Donetsk and Lugansk regions and Crimea about experience of violence. But there's not a whole lot of stuff that's looked systematically at direct experience of violence and loss and its effect on identity. So I think this is something hopefully new and hopefully interesting to you. We're looking around for literature. Always when you're doing research, that you start off with the idea of, okay, here's my question, what's been written on it, right? And very often the answer is, well, directly, not a whole lot, as I just mentioned. So what are kind of cognate literatures? What are literatures that are about something a bit different, but could inform us on the kinds of things we might expect to see? And there's a bunch of different ones, and so I'm going to walk you through some of those and to help kind of create a baseline understanding and to motivate our hypotheses about what we expect to see with individuals in Ukraine. The terrorist literature, there's been a big literature emerging in the last decade or so on the effects of terrorism on people's attitudes. And long story short, the findings are that essentially terrorist attacks alienate people and they drive them away from the causes that are supported by the terrorists, and they drive them into more repressive attitudes. So Getmansky and Zaitsov, she's a Ukrainian researcher, looking at the experience of shelling from Palestinian territories into Israel. People who have been around areas that have been affected by shelling tend to get driven into more anti-Palestinian, hard-right Israeli parties, right? So you get a backlash effect amongst the population that are exposed to violence coming from the Palestinian territories, right? Essentially you get this polarization that emerges, and there's a number of other articles in different contexts that show. So the Arvez piece is really interesting because it shows that this is a study of people living in societies that are typically welcoming to immigrants, right? So Sweden, the Netherlands, and then they look at the effect of terrorist attacks there, and what they find is that terrorist attacks don't change the attitudes of people who don't like migrants because they don't like them already, so whatever. What they do change is the attitudes of left-leaning people who are previously very sympathetic to migrants. They become less sympathetic. They also change the attitudes of better educated people. So the people who are the allies, in some sense, of the migrants, they become pushed away, right? Which is sort of, I guess, what the terrorists are trying to do, I suppose. So this is sort of interesting literature on the effects of violence. People become more polarized. There's another really interesting literature about militarized state violence. So what's the effect when governments go around bombing civilian populations? Much of this is driven by the US government, which has gone around the world bombing civilian populations a fair bit over the years. And it's focused on research first of all, in Vietnam, and then in the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what you see, essentially, is that bombing tends to alienate the population that you're dropping bombs on top of, right? And pushes them into the hands of, in most of these cases, in fact, all of these cases, US opponents, right? So if you want to alienate the population and you want to drive them to hate you rather than to give in, bombing them is a good idea, right? And so bombing as a counterinsurgency tactic in Vietnam actually made people more supportive of the Viet Cong, of the communist government. There's a bunch of studies on that. Airstrikes in Afghanistan increased, not decreased, insurgent attacks in Afghanistan. Drones that kill insurgent leaders tend to lead to more insurgent attacks, not less afterwards, right? So if you want to increase the number of insurgent attacks, bombing the regions to kill the insurgents is a good way to get more, right? So in other words, there's a backlash, a rebound effect. Ethnic-based interstate war. So this is the war in Yugoslavia. I actually began my career working in Yugoslavia during the war. And the story that was told then, and the story that I was familiar with and I was expecting to see, is that war, that sort of basically war between states, but states that are identified very closely with particular ethnic groups. So Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia is divided, obviously. That those wars would actually accentuate and aggravate inter-ethnic conflict, sharpen ethnic divisions, and make violence more probable later. And what you actually see is, so that's the sort of the theory part. There's lots of theory about this, lots of people saying this, but actually empirically it's a little more nuanced than that. It's a little more interesting than that. You do see certainly the kind of disappearance of Yugoslav identities during the war. Before the war, the majority of the population of Yugoslavia, if you ask them in surveys, what's your nationality, they would say Yugoslav. That just disappears overnight, as Yugoslavia disappears overnight. And you do see increases in ethnic identification, you do see increases in sort of ethnic animosity, but a lot of this is driven by sort of state strategies, it's driven by people feeling a lack of sense of options. And so when you push under the survey data and you actually do kind of more qualitative focus groups, you find people are much more ambivalent than the sort of headline story would suggest. And then there's also research that suggests that personal experience of violence, and this is what we're really talking about this morning, is personal experience of violence as opposed to being in a society that's been subject to violence, didn't make any difference to people's levels of ethno-nationalism, right? Quite surprisingly. So people who had actually lost loved ones, people who had lost property, were no more likely to express hostility or nationalist perspectives than people who hadn't in these contexts. It's a really interesting set of findings. And then finally, the last sort of literature that we were thinking about is literature that's really specifically from Ukraine, and is literature about repression during the Soviet period and the effects of repression during the Soviet period. And there's a couple of different perspectives on this. Lupin and Pesyakin wrote about the effects of the deportation of Tatars by Stalin, and the relationship between that and identification with Tatar identity and with Tatar language, and with attitudes to Russians. And what they found was that experience of that, people who remembered that experience were more likely to express anti-Russian sentiments, were more likely to identify more strongly as Tatar than others. So mass deportation leads actually to a paradoxically to a strengthening of identity, not the breaking up of the nation that Stalin had sought. Rossinas and others has a couple of papers showing that the experience of the Holodomor and also deportation in Ukraine leads to a growth in Ukrainian identities and weaker support for pro-Russian parties, even in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the post-communist era. So you can match repression in the Stalinist era with political behavior in the post-communist era. So in other words, this is not individuals who personally suffer, but individuals whose families were affected 2 or 3 generations before. So these effects of political violence kind of ripple through the generations and are handed down. We're working today with much shorter term data, obviously, but it's sort of interesting to see how these things go. And then Sasa and Lackner, in the paper that I mentioned before, they're looking at experience of the Donbass war in 2014, 2015, and I think 2016, if I remember rightly. And what they find essentially is there is some increased sense of ethnic identity amongst people who suffered losses during the war, but it's actually kind of a mixed picture, and empirically it's a little bit more like the Yugoslav case, what they find. So that's the background. That's what everybody else has found, right? And that informs our expectations about what we're going to find, and I'll say what those are specifically in a second. We collected 2 different kinds of data in order to understand the effects of violence. One is based on the same surveys that I talked about yesterday, the national surveys that we did with Razumkov in 2015 and 2016. We spoke, as I mentioned, with 1,800 people in 2015, and then the same individuals the year after, nearly 1,300 of them, and got their experiences and how they changed over time. And then we conducted research since the full-scale invasion from February of last year. And what we did with this is we basically used 2 surveys. One survey that we had run in 2021 before the invasion, before the full-scale invasion, and then a different survey with 2,000 people that we ran in August and September of last year. Now, the difference between these 2 things is these are the same people, and these are different people, right? This is what's called a fresh cross-section, right? This one's really good for identifying the causes of changes over time. This one's a problem, right? Because we don't know people's attitudes before. But we have a trick that I'm going to show you that I hope gets us around the problem. And this is where the 21 survey comes in. All right, so here's our hypothesis. Based on all that literature, we figured that respondents who've been directly exposed to violence are more likely to increase their identification with Ukraine as a state, right? So that civic identity, that growth in civic identity that I talked about emerging from the Euromaidan, we should see even more of that. This is, after all, a state-to-state war, right? That Ukraine is a state rather than Ukrainians or ethnic Ukrainians as individuals that are getting attacked, right? Well, not rather than, as well as, I should say. So we expect to see a growth in civic identity. We also expect to see a growth in ethnic identity. That's what we saw to a certain extent in the earlier work on the Donbass from Sasa and Lackner. We expect to see an increase in the use of Ukrainian language amongst individuals who are exposed to violence. That's, again, part of the broader trend, the broader current that we've seen since the Euromaidan. And we expect to see, not surprisingly, given who's doing the aggression here, that people will have more negative attitudes towards Russians, right? And we have various different ways of measuring this I'll talk about in a second. So those are our major expectations. There's one caveat, though. It really matters when you experience violence who you think is to blame for it. right? So blame allocation obviously is really important. There's a really interesting study by Pichenkina, another Ukrainian researcher, who studied using an experiment, really, rather than a actual experience of violence. We used a survey experiment to look at different sources of blame for losses during the first phase of the Russian invasion. People who blame, in her story, people who blamed the Russian government, sorry, for the war in Donbass, behave the way that we expect them to. But she found actually that there was quite a lot of people who blamed the Ukrainian state, not the Russians. So what we did was we also asked people who they blame for the events, and we would expect to see, following her experimental research, the opposite effect. All of these things should go in the opposite direction if you blame the Ukrainians for the conflict. This obviously is much more germane for the 2014 Donbass war than the more recent invasion. So how do we measure all of this stuff? Well, so we measure civic identity in two different ways. We actually started doing this in 2012 and have seen enormous changes over time with it. We asked people what they consider their homeland, their Batkivshchina in Ukrainian, Rodina in Russian. And you see this evolution over time in what people's answers are to those questions. Back in 2012, when we started to ask this, there was roughly half, maybe 40% or so, would say Ukraine. And then the rest would say all sorts of other things. Like some people would say the Soviet Union. Some people would say their region, Donetsk, Kyiv. So their identifications were much more local. We've seen an enormous increase in people saying Ukraine over time in the broader population. So we're looking here specifically at violence. Does this violence have a role in this story? We also asked in 2022 how important identification with the Ukrainian state is to you as your own identity. So, okay, so you say, my homeland is Ukraine, but like, do you care? Like, how big a deal is that for you as a human being? If you think about yourself, how important is being Ukrainian to you, in addition to being, I don't know, smart, good-looking, athletic, creative, all these other kinds of things that people are, right, and that they cherish. How important is that? We ask about ethnic identity. We ask, what is your nationality? This is a kind of old standard survey question. We ask people what language they use at home. Do you speak only Ukrainian? Do you speak mostly Ukrainian? Do you speak both Ukrainian and Russian? Mostly Russian or only Russian or something else? That, again, we see some really interesting evolution. I think this is a kind of a hard test of the language use question. There's debate, and if you read the Kolik thing, you'll end up, I think, a bit confused about all the different ways that we can think of what language means, whether it's your native language or the language you use in school or the language you use at work, or we ask about home language because we think that's kind of probably the most stable, most authentic expression of what you do. There's debates about that. We ask, on attitudes to Russians, we ask, this is a kind of standard question that's derived from research in the United States in the 1980s when they were asking about racial attitudes. They would say, how do you feel about African Americans? And everyone's like, yeah, fine, great, yeah, no, love them. And then they would say, well, how do you feel about having neighbors who were African American? And then the attitudes were really, really different. They're like, oh, well, not as my neighbor, right, obviously. So we ask about the desirability of having Russian neighbors. We also ask about gay people, about Jewish people, about alcoholics, about a whole range of different kinds of neighbors, so that it's not really obvious, like why, where it's kind of mixed in as a thing. We asked that in 2015 and in 2022. And then finally, in 2021, we developed a set of questions around, what what you would expect a good Ukrainian to be, a good citizen of Ukraine should, right? And then lots of different options, and people can evaluate from asking them about, they should speak Ukrainian, they should wear national dress, they should do different kinds of things. The thing we're going to be looking at here is attitudes towards Russia. So they should support, they should oppose closer relations with Russia. They should avoid Russian social media. They should not watch Russian state television, right? Or Russian television channels in Ukraine. Back then, there were Russian TV channels in Ukraine. And so to put this together as a kind of general indicator of how important it is for a Ukrainian to turn their face away from Russia. And this is a measure we've only just started kind of playing with, and I think there's probably going to be a lot of interesting stuff going to come out of it. Yeah? Yeah, so that's a really good question. When we started asking this question back in 2012, what we had in mind were ethnic Russian neighbors. By the time we're asking this question in 2022, then this issue seems more stark, right? More important, whether it's Russian citizens or ethnic Russians. So we had to think about, do we change the question to clarify it and lose the time series? Or do we stick with this measure that's like maybe not quite as good as it was before, might mean something a wee bit different? So when you've been doing collection over a decade, you tend to stick with, there's a lot of status quo bias. But you're completely correct. That's a really smart insight. Thank you for that. Because it could make a difference to the, this is where having this other measure is actually pretty useful, because it allows us to kind of calibrate a little bit. And what we do with these before I get into the actual measurement stuff, we put them all on a 0 to 1 scale. They're all basically, I think, 5-point scales. A couple of them are 7-point scales, but we put them on a 0 to 1 scale so that we can make them uniform. And then for our dependent variables in the jargon, for the factors that we're interested in the effect of, we asked two different kinds of questions. In the 2015-2016 survey, we asked people to the extent to which their family suffered due to the Donbass war, right? That's just the simple phrasing of the question. To what extent did your family suffer during the Donbass war? And we make it a dummy variable, yes or no. We also asked to what extent do you have friends and family, neighbors, kind of broader community that suffered. We find that about 9% say their family suffered directly from the Donbass war. Now, this is people only in government-controlled parts of Ukraine, right? So not in the occupied Donbass, right? Where obviously the numbers would be much higher. They're actually also spread across the country, which is probably partly due to refugees, right? And displaced people. And then we ask to what extent, like, those damages, whose fault was it? Was it the Russians' fault? Who do you blame? Do you blame the Russian government? Do you blame the Ukrainian government, or do you blame both, right? So the Pachenkina question. And then in 2022, we ask a couple of different kinds of questions. We ask people if they lost friends and family during the war. About 28% of our respondents said they had. I don't know how good it's a good measure amongst our respondents. I don't know how representative of the broader population that is. I heard last night that there is some data from the Kiev Institute of Sociology, and so I'd be really interested to see how our numbers match up with theirs. Then we asked if people have relatives, so family serving in the army, the territorial defense unit, or who are acting as volunteers during the war. And those numbers are kind of in the 30-somethings. And some people have all of those things. Some people have only one of those things. There's actually maybe more variation across those than I would have thought, but yeah. Okay, so those are our dependent variables. Let's talk about the methods a little bit. The Donbass War is really easy from a methodological perspective because we have a panel, right? So we do what's called a static score model. Essentially, we look at an outcome, Y, in 2016, in the second period, so your attitude towards Russian neighbors, say, or how much you speak Ukrainian at home. And we regress it on whether you've had costs from the war, right? Whether you say that your family, we use the narrow measure for this. The results are similar with the broader measure, but we thought the narrower measure, just your family was more representative. So that's a 1 or a 0, depending on whether or not you had family effects. And then we regress that on your level of the dependent variable in the previous year, right? T minus 1. So if you say, I speak, only Ukrainian at home, but last year you said I spoke both, YT would be only Ukrainian and YT minus 1 would be both, right? And so what we capture from that is the change. We don't capture the levels, we capture the change. That's what's really important, right? So everything is controlling for what you did before. And that's what gives us the causal effect of the war cost, and then we add a bunch of control variables, that's the X term, as they were in 2015, so there's no post-treatment bias. And then we weight it for attrition, like I talked about yesterday. So these are the results. What we find is, so let me explain again how we interpret these. This is the effect on the outcome variable. These are sort of percentage effects on the scale of 1 to 4. Sorry, on the scale of 0 to 1. 1 to 4 was yesterday. Today is 0 to 1. So these are sort of like the unit effect of having suffered on Ukrainian civic identity, on Ukrainian ethnic identity, and then some other things I'll show you in a minute, of having had some family losses during the Donbass War. And broken down by whether you blame the Ukrainian government, the rebels, and the Ukrainian government, or just the rebels, right? For your losses. And what we see, really interesting, is amongst the small population that blame the Ukrainian government. It's about 5% of our sample say they blame the Ukrainian government. Interesting. There's a pretty big effect. There's like half of a point on negative effect on their expression of a Ukrainian civic identity, the extent to which they think of Ukraine as a homeland, right? So that's really big. It's a very small population, but it's really big. And because we have the previous values, this is pretty well controlled for us. It really is the effect of the suffering in the war, right? This is, I think, quite tight from a methodological perspective. If you blame both, then you don't move very much, and it's not clear that there's any effect either way on your identity. But if you blame the rebels, there's a small but statistically significant effect on increasing the extent to which you see Ukraine as a homeland. So this fits our hypothesis. But I think what's interesting is the relative size of these effects. Right? The size of the effect is pretty small in the positive direction if you blame the rebels, but it's large if you blame the government. Although these numbers, this is much higher than, a much bigger proportion than this number, right? It's about 10% there, and this is only about 4%. So it's about twice as many people blame the rebels as blame the government, right? So it's sort of a nuanced picture, right? It depends on who you blame, and the effects are bigger, but for a smaller group if you blame the government. If you're looking at Ukrainian ethnic identity, so to what extent you think of yourself as ethnically Ukrainian, you get the same picture. You get a slightly smaller effect, a couple of points. If you blame the government, you get a similarly small effect if you blame the rebels. So the effect goes again in the way that we expected, depending on who you allocate responsibility to the war for. In terms of languages, what language you use at home, this is, as I mentioned, I think this is a super hard test, and so you would sort of expect no effect, really, because the language you speak at home doesn't change much, but except that it sort of does. And we find that people who blame the government move somewhat 1 point of 1 point on the scale, so about 10%, towards speaking more Russian, and people who blame the rebels move somewhat to speaking more Ukrainian, right? So there is, even at this level and in this very short time frame, effects on language use. And then on attitudes to Russians, people who blame the Ukrainian government for their losses in the Donbass war like Russian neighbors more, and people who blame the rebels like Russian neighbors less, right? Again, as you might expect from, or as we did expect in the hypotheses, and people who don't know who to blame don't change their attitudes. So that's the Donbass war. That's the first part of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Very much along the lines of what we expected to see, but I think kind of interesting to see that sort of polarization amongst people who blame different sides. For the full-scale war, we have a problem because we only have data from a cross-section, right, from last fall, 2022. So how do we actually work out what the impact is, right? Without the panel component, what do we do? Well, we used this earlier survey from 2021. We were actually interested in that back in those days when, you remember COVID? Does anybody remember COVID? Seemed to be a big problem, right? We were doing surveys in Ukraine about attitudes towards COVID, and we used the same questions. And we used a similar sampling method. We used Qualtrics online surveys. So the Razumkov data is cool because it's face-to-face interviews. These are online surveys, and so it's a slightly different sample. It skews a little more educated. It skews a little younger. But we can weight the data to try and using the census weights to try and get around that. What we do to get around the problem of the lack of panel element is we basically create a synthetic dependent variable from the previous round. So we simulate, using questions from 2021, what people's attitudes would be if we had the same people in 2022. So we make regressions and we work out what are the factors that shape home language use, that shape attitudes towards Russian neighbors, that shape Ukrainian identity, ethnicity, and Ukrainian civic identity, those same 4 dependent variables. We use this 2021 data, work out all of those factors, and then go into the 2022 data and calculate an answer based not on the outcomes, but on the regressors, right? So we simulate a set of answers for 2022, and then we use those in the static score regressions, the same setup, right? So we don't actually speak to the same people, but we take the same sampling method, and then we simulate what their answers would have been had it still been 2021, right? And making the assumption this all rests on is that there's nothing different about the 2022 sample other than the fact that it's 2022, right? That we can't already control for mathematically. So that's the setup. I'm interested in whether you buy it or not. That's what we did. And so we did the same setup. These are the same kinds of charts: civic identity, ethnic identity, the marginal change on this scale. The first thing to know is these effects are much smaller than the effects in the Donbass. They're a tenth. The scales we're using are a tenth of the size, right? So these are actually quite small effects, substantively speaking. And we look at whether people report having lost friends, whether they have a relative in the army, in the territorial defense, or have volunteered. And what we find is, across the board, a small but statistically significant, with the exception of the territorial defense, positive changes in increases in Ukrainian civic identity and in Ukrainian ethnic identity. So there's real effects going on here. They're not massive, they're not transformative, but they're there. Home language use, again, real effects. These are actually a bit larger in terms of using more Ukrainian amongst people who've lost friends and family, and people who have family serving in the army. You tend to use more Ukrainian at home than they did the year before. Again, null effects for the Territorial Defense Force, and effects and similar size effects for having family who are volunteers. And then in terms of Russian neighbors, again, small but significant effects for less acceptable attitudes to Russian neighbors for people who have lost friends and family, people who have family serving in the military, in the army. Again, no results on territorial defense. You guys will have to explain to me why that is. And same effects for volunteers. Using our other anti-Russian identity conception of the importance of turning your back on Russian information and Russia, again, positive effects for 3 of our 4 outcomes. And again, small. Right? I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which this is happening, but it's real, it's there, and at least so far, it's not massive. Right? All right, conclusions. I'll finally stop talking at some point. We have consistent evidence that exposure to Russian violence strengthens Ukrainian identity and turns people against Russia. Right? It's maybe smaller than one might anticipate, but it's definitely there. We find it in both periods. It's actually quite big in the Donbass period. It's smaller in the full-scale invasion. This may be an artifact of the fact that we have a small group of people who suffered direct effects of violence in the Donbass period. It's, again, like about 9%, whereas we have a much larger group, around 30% or so, depending which category we're talking about, in the current part of the conflict. Maybe that's what's going on. And these effects are really broad. They go across all sorts of different conceptions of identity and nationality. We have weaker effects for territorial defense units. Like I say, I'd be interested to hear why that might be. And blame matters. It does matter which side you blame, at least in the 2014. To be quite honest with you, we didn't ask about blame in 2022 because it felt like a stupid question. Maybe we should have. I don't know. Open questions. Does our fix for the lack of the panel component convince you? Does that sound like it works? And then the question of mechanisms. What's driving these changes in identity? What connects the experience of violence with a change in home language or the extent to which you relate to a certain kind of nationality? What we're finding is emotions really matter. I mentioned earlier on that my interests in recent years have been very much in political psychology. I've been really interested in emotions in particular, in anger and fear, anxiety, those kinds of things. These results, I don't have the data, but I was like playing around with it over the last couple of days. These results are driven by anger, mostly. It's people who have suffered violence and then say they're very angry about it. Those are the ones that have these changes in identity. Some people are not angry about it, which I think is incredibly interesting, or at least they don't say they're angry about it. Some people express fear. But for those who express anger, you get these, that's part, or it seems to be part, at least based on my initial exploration of the data, of what's going on. Yeah?
For me, it's hard to believe that this marginal effect, that they are so narrow, because after
after the full-scale invasion, even our like media sphere became more certain about like who's the aggressor,
Right.
who's the source of violence. Many of the, I don't know, opinion leaders switched from Russian language in public to Ukrainian. So a lot of, I don't know, like signs or this anecdotal evidence from like public sphere shows that this like identity in terms of the state, the language, the community became, I don't know, at least stronger and more visible in public. So for me, it really, like, I'm really surprised to see this really
size.
narrow effects. And like, do you have any explanation how that can coexist, like this data and the, I don't know, the public domain in Ukraine, and like calling even spade a spade, calling Russian aggression because prior to the war, not every politician or public person was that straight about, I know, calling Russia an aggressor.
Right. That's a brilliant question. There's a couple of things that could be happening. One thing that could be happening is that as a statistical thing, that we've been so cautious in simulating all these previous attitudes, and then we've got all these different controls that we've basically strangled the thing, and we've not left much room for a causal effect. Like we've over controlled the data. So what we should show is just kind of simple comparisons without statistical controls. That would be really interesting to do, and I'll write that down in a sec. The other thing that could be happening is that this is a short period of time, right? So we're talking about, we did this survey in the fall of 2022. I mean, it's a short period of time. I'm sure it felt like a long period of time between February and the fall of last year. It may be that opinion leaders, public figures, people in the media sphere, they react much faster. And mass public opinion, which is what we're talking about here, follows more slowly. That's a possibility. I don't know. But I think that one of the things that we need to dig into more is exactly that process that you talked about switches in the public sphere. I think that'll help us contextualize and bring out some of the qualitative aspects. So that's really helpful. And if you can think of other reasons why that might be the case, why these effects might be small, I'm definitely all ears. Yeah.
Thanks. Maybe just a small comment on what's being asked and said. I think right now, well, basically you can be accused of treason if you continue openly support Russia and say that, maybe it's Ukraine to blame, etc. So it's a criminal administrative responsibility for that. That's my opinion. Many politicians are switching to aligning with Ukraine. It might be the reason. I wanted to ask, so I assume you interviewed people across Ukraine, right?
Yeah. So this is the first round. The first surveys, the Donbass surveys, are nationally representative. The second ones are as close as we could get with an online sample. So we do have people all across the country, and then we weight it for regions. So the results are weighted. So there may actually be fewer people in parts of Ukraine, and this is all only government-held territory, right? This is not Russian-occupied areas.
But I was wondering if you maybe internally had a look if the data varies, let's say, for territories which were directly exposed, like which were under occupation, and those, let's say, in other parts of Ukraine where, of course, you're also exposed to the violence. I mean, you might have relatives in the army, or you might have occasional air raid sirens. So basically, to be very straightforward, the level of exposure of people who live in Kramatorsk and in Uzhgorod is like totally different.
Right.
Did you try to see the difference between the responses between those regions?
So we also looked at experience of air raid sirens. How often? We asked people, how often do you hear sirens? How often do you take shelter? How often has your community experienced bombing? And the results are all over the place. They're kind of messy. And so I don't really know what to do with them yet, which is why I didn't present them, because I'm not confident that I know what's going on. But the effects go in a bunch of different directions. They go, you know, and I think it might just be small numbers. So the problem with air raid sirens is everybody reports very high levels of air raid sirens. So the lowest is like once a week, and then the highest is like, you know, 6 or 7 times a day. And particularly the period we were asking, it was very common. And so it's hard to distinguish sort of psychologically between does, you know, something that's frightening the first few times becomes less frightening over time often. And so, you know, the more often you hear the sirens, is that a more intense treatment, or is that kind of a less intense treatment? Is there some kind of curvilinear relationship going on where if you never hear the sirens, you don't feel affected? If you hear them sometimes, you feel very affected, and if you hear them all the time, you've kind of, you know, tuned it out a little bit. You guys have been hearing sirens much longer than I have, so tell me if that's right or not.
Maybe
so
just
I don't know.
One thing that in some regions, air siren most likely would be followed by explosions, by shelling, and in others less likely. So it's also not about the intensity of air raid sirens, but let's say there are cities which would be shelled daily,
Yeah.
then there are others that would be shelled, I don't know, every week, every few weeks, and then there are other areas which will be maybe shelled once in 3 months, 6 months, and there are areas that were never shelled.
Yeah. So we looked at shelling, and as I haven't got consistent results of that yet. It just seems to bounce around a lot. But maybe what you're telling me, or what I'm hearing, is what matters is how you categorize quantity. So never, you know, maybe smaller categories, or rather, you know, bigger categories, but a smaller number of categories that will allow us to get more leverage statistically. That might be the problem. The truth is with these kinds of data is you're always struggling between two things. One is there really an effect and I just can't find it statistically? And so do I have to do something different statistically? Or is there not really an effect and you know, it's just not there, and no matter what I do statistically, it's not going to be there? And we're still in that kind of, you know, process with some of this data. This is both the perils and the advantage of presenting work at this incredibly early stage. Is that there are some questions that I just don't really know the answer to yet.
Thank you.
But thank you for the suggestions.
Hello, thank you for your presentation and information, your data. I want to ask you a question. Have you looked at the control variables, such stuff as, for example, people who were forced to move from their native towns or native cities to the other parts of Ukraine? And as well, we talk about being exposed to the violence, but also war like leads to other negatives impacts on the people, such as decrease of the income level, of their destruction of their property. So maybe such economic factors as well can be like treated within this model. And I also want to ask you to clarify for me the idea of modeling. So when you talked about the second set of the data, what's the idea of modeling that you described? Because to be honest, I didn't catch it. Can
Sure.
you clarify it? Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in terms of controlling for whether people are internally displaced, we can do that. I haven't done that yet. That's a great idea. That's in the data. The economic stuff we haven't looked at yet. But that would be a good kind of comparison. So to get back to the question of why these effects are small compared to what, right? And so if we were able to look at the economic effects, and we ask people, you know, to what extent have you lost income, you know, a lot, a little, all of it. that's a really nice idea for, okay, these effects are small, but they're bigger than this, or they're small and they're much smaller than, so that's a really good idea for calibrating. In terms of the synthetic dependent variable, essentially what we do is we go back to go back to the data from 2021, right? And we look at, let's just focus on your extent of to which being Ukrainian is an important part of your identity, right? We ask people that in 2021. So then we regress that on a number of factors, and we find the basic relationship between where you live, what language you speak, education, income, age, those kinds of things. And so we have that basic setup, and then we use that to predict what the relationship is between each of those variables and the outcome, on average. We then go to the data from 2022, and we plug each of those individuals into that equation and predict a score for them. So if the relationship between all those variables were the same for this new sample as they were for the original 2,000 people, and that statistically is a reasonably good bet because it's a big sample, right? Within 2 or 3 percentage points on each person, we should have a pretty good handle on what their score would be if we had asked them. And so we take those predicted scores for the 22 people, and we put that as what they thought last year. And so this method is possibly one that it's quite conservative, and that may be why we're finding these small effects, because we're already throwing in virtually everything you can think of that's going to shape your attitude, and all we're leaving is this issue of who you have serving in various different parts of the war. So is that a bit clearer?
Yep, thank you.
Sure. We have down here, and I'll get to you in a sec.
Thank you. Well, I have 2 questions, and the first one is about Homo sovieticus in Ukraine, this type of Soviet citizen. How do you think, is it still alive, at least in some groups in Ukraine, this Homo sovieticus? And if so, how can it affect war, people's attitudes to war and their behavior, especially in occupied territories? And the second question is, well, it's good to have this anti-Russian identity and citizenship during the course of war, because it increases how risky you are and how are you intended to go to war. But after the war, and especially, for example, when eventually the regime in Russia will be changed, I think that this anti-Russian identity will be very harmful for developing peace with Russia, and therefore the situation in our region will be very unstable. So what government in Ukraine should do to change maybe narrative somehow after the war to make it more useful for further peace building in our region and with Russia, when democratization happened there, sooner or later? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So the first question was about this concept of Homo sovieticus, of Soviet person, Soviet man. This is a sort of, I associate this term a lot with Russian sociologists, with the Levada Center in particular, right? And this idea that there is a sort of passive, disengaged, angry, kind of lumpen, useless kind of person created by the Soviet era. I have to say that both from a sociological and a kind of ethical perspective, I don't like that kind of talk. I think it's sort of, I think empirically it's pretty unreliable, and I think it has a lot of kind of normative ugliness to it. And I also think that, you know, all societies have people like that. And so to sort of associate that as being kind of a unique Soviet creation, you should meet some of my relatives, some of my family, extended family back in Scotland. They also fit that description. So I think that I don't use that terminology at all. I prefer to kind of meet people where I find them, and where I find them in Ukraine certainly is there's enormous variation, right? And some people are very, very disengaged, and some people are very engaged, right? And so we look at levels of engagement rather than kind of trying to put these things together into really into a malady, into a diagnosis, which is what I think this term does. So I don't like that term at all. I know others use it. In terms of an anti-Russian identity being harmful post-war, I think that's a really interesting point. I think that, as I said yesterday, I don't come to Ukraine to give advice to Ukrainians and tell them what to do, or tell the Ukrainian government what to do, or to pretend that I know what it's like. And so I'm very unenthusiastic about offering advice. But what I will say is that a lot of things happen during wartime, and attitudes that were previously not mainstream get normalized. And that can have really negative effects afterwards. And the example that I have in mind in particular is Chechnya, and the war against Russia that was fought in the early 1990s in Chechnya. And what happened there was a case in which the Chechen government was able to repel a really incompetent Russian assault and a really nasty, violent Russian war that lasted for a couple of years, and then basically Yeltsin was forced to make peace because he had elections coming up. And so Chechnya survived as an independent entity, even if not internationally recognized. And the government was corrupt, incompetent, and disorganized, but it was protected by the myth of the great victory, the story of the great victory over Russia. And that was used to paper over all sorts of really bad things that were happening in Chechnya at the time. And that's a bad thing. That's kind of what you're pointing to, right? Like scapegoating the enemy or living off the past, living off former victories, allows sometimes governments to do bad things in the post-war period. And so I'm not at all trying to say that what's happening in Ukraine has parallels with Chechnya. Don't misinterpret. What I am saying is that after the war, that's a different situation. It depends on how the war ends. It depends on when. If we're waiting for Russia to democratize, I've been waiting a long time for Russia to democratize. I've pretty much given up on that. I think I might be retired and long gone right before that happens. That's a different set of questions. But I think it's very important, and I think you're right to have the instinct to think about what's going to be functional after the war relative to what's functional during the war. And I think that's a good sentiment to have. Yeah. Actually, sorry, I saw you first, and then over here. No, I have to make you run after the microphone.
Thanks.
I love your sweatshirt, by the way.
Thank you.
That's my hometown. So.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. And there are two things that I wanted to ask or hypothesize. So the first one is about this weaker effects of territorial defense units, and I was wondering whether, while receiving the survey, the respondents had a clear definition of what territorial defense units is, because I think a lot of people confuse territorial defense units with the voluntary formations of territorial hromadas. And maybe that could be the reason why there are weaker effects to some extent. And then the second one is with relation to these opposite effects of violence based on the which side they blame. And if we hypothesize that the people that live in territories of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts that are still under occupation and were under this occupation for 9 years now, that they have completely opposite results. So yeah, they have a stronger anti-Ukrainian identity growing. Just to, to dwell on what are possible solutions for the Ukrainian government and the first steps to be made there when the Ukrainian government gets control back, and what are the possible and I presume difficult solutions there will be to get over this strong emotions of anger to the Ukrainian government or the military forces as the people perceive. I mean, I don't want here to sound as that people necessarily, that this is necessarily were the Ukrainian armed forces who, yes, it sounds in Ukrainian media a lot bombed Donetsk and Luhansk cities, but that's how the media there puts it. So, yeah. Sorry for a long...
Yeah, no, not at all, sure. So I have one good answer and one no answer. So in terms of the territorial defense units, yeah, we just used that expression, and it could well be there's confusion as to what that means, and it could well be that, our thought was, and I wonder what you guys think about this, is that the territorial defense units are less likely to experience direct conflict, direct violence. And so perhaps it's less stressful for the relatives of people who are in the territorial defense as opposed to the army. And so the effects are small. I don't know if that's a plausible...
Yeah, just a small comment on this. I'm not sure whether that's something publicly available, but I think as of now, at least some units of this big territorial defense formated, almost all of them have been at least a short period of time in the direct front line.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's a similar kind of thing with what's called National Guard in the US, which is not national at all, it's actually state level, and they get rotated into wars sometimes. So I was wondering, so that's actually really helpful to know. In terms of the opposite results for people who blame, what's really interesting about this is not people who are in the occupied territories. These are people who were in territory that was, at least in 2015 and 2016, government controlled. And this is also kind of fits in with some other research that I published about attitudes to the EU. What we found is that alongside this sort of growing kind of civic identity across Ukraine and growing kind of patriotic sense in Ukraine, there is a small group of people who are going in the opposite direction, even in Ukrainian-controlled territories. And so we found that we did a paper on polarization, and we found that as most people in Ukraine were moving towards pro-EU positions, in certain communities, mostly in the south and east, they were moving away from pro-EU positions, and that there's quite a strong local dynamic to that. And so this data is a little bit like that, where you get the majority moving in one direction, and then a much smaller, this 4%, moving in the opposite direction. People who are living in Ukraine and the government-controlled Ukraine. And so the integration post-war challenge is going to involve not only people in former occupied territories, but other people in those regions who were never occupied too, who have a different narrative about what happened. And I think, I don't have any brilliant ideas about how to handle that. I think that is going to be obviously an enormous challenge. And if you think about bringing Donetsk city back, into Ukraine, it was the biggest city in Ukraine, right? So that's a huge thing, and will be a really enormous challenge financially, because you imagine what a mess it must be, and then also politically and socially. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, just pass it over and get to you next.
Thank you. Thank you for great lecture. And could we take from this data information and some conclusions about mobility of citizens? Could we take into account internally displaced person or mobility outside of Ukraine, and some kind of data you have about this type of mobility? And what is the results of taking into account news from, for example, Russia TV or Ukrainian TV or Telegram channels or from YouTube? What is the results of on identity, maybe?
Yeah, so on mobility, we have some data on, we asked people about whether they're internally displaced. We tried very hard to survey only people in Ukraine, right? And so with the face-to-face stuff, obviously that's easy because our interviewers are in Ukraine. With the online stuff, it's a little more tricky. But we're reasonably confident it's mostly people in Ukraine. We don't, so in other words, if you want mobility data, Ola Onuch is the person to talk to. She has this big project on mobility. It's called Mobilize, is her project with Gwen Sassa, who I also mentioned. They have tons of data on mobility, on people who've moved outside of Ukraine. We just don't have data of that kind. We do have internally displaced. I haven't looked at it yet, and that's the proportion in our sample who was internally displaced in the face-to-face data and the Donbass period was really, really small. In part, I think that's because we were interviewing in apartments and using telephone books and whatnot. The second question was about media. So we did not find in the Donbass stuff very interesting results about different kinds of media. And what's kind of interesting is that holds not only for this project, the project on violence, but it also holds on the same data that we used around COVID. And that the Ukrainian public opinion, you'll know better this than I do, so I'd love to talk with you about it. But in our data, at least, the Ukrainian public opinion doesn't seem very structured by different media sources. So I've done lots of work in Russia where you can ask someone where they get their news, and I can tell you everything else about them, right? That's not the case in Ukraine. In part because the media as much is hey, it's free, right? Whereas in Russia, it's not, right? And so it's politically much more controlled. And so I don't know what you found, but we don't find very much of strong, effects out of different media.
Thank you.
Yeah. Over here.
So my question also may be quite long, but okay. So from my perspective, before the Maidan happened, you are Ukrainian as long as you live in Ukraine or like immigrated from Ukraine. After the Maidan, you are like true Ukrainian as long as you don't have friends in Russia. Mm-hmm. And then after the full-scale invasion, you are a true Ukrainian as long as you don't have friends in Russia and speak Ukrainian and consume kind of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian content. So the question of culture becomes important. And talking about culture, like before the Maidan, in popular culture, it was all Russia. And then when you dive kind of deeper, let's say, an underground culture. It's all Russia as well. And then after the revolution, it is still all Russia in popular culture, but it is unexpectedly Ukraine when you dive deeper. So, and then it shifts to all Ukraine, like after the full-scale invasion. And like, as for me, for example, it was the case that I firstly discovered Ukrainian culture, and then, like, I'm a native Russian speaker, so, and then after that, I shifted to Ukrainian language, and I found, like, stronger, let's say, connection to Ukrainian state and Ukrainian identity. So have you, my question is, have you considered that, like, the question of culture and the center of this culture that people consume? Is it in Ukraine or is it in Russia? So what can you say about that?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for that. It's really interesting, and you know, these are always like quantitative, 2,000 people averaged out, and so it's incredibly interesting to hear your perspective. We only really started to introduce culture in the surveys in 21. You know, I'm like most sociologists, we're kind of like really reformed Marxists, right? So it doesn't occur to us to ask about culture. We ask about employment and education and all of these kinds of things, and we ask about information, right? And we ask about where you get your information. We ask about language sources, but we're not strong on asking about cultural content. And I think that's a feeling of my discipline, right? In other words, it's not my fault, it's their fault. No, it's something that we've not paid enough attention to. I think there are like really great anthropologists in Ukraine, and Ukraine. So I think of Tanya Lokot, who's a Ukrainian anthropologist, very much involved in what she calls the affordances of social media. So she looks at kind of social media, and it's not just like I would do, which is to say, how much of your news do you get from social media, right? That's kind of a dumb political sciencey question, but actually look at content and language of content, but more also the kind of cultural content. I put my hands and say, yeah, we don't do that well. You know, we can get rough kind of stab at it by, you know, our questions about good Ukrainians do, and we have a list of 20 different things. But they don't have anything like the kind of sophisticated nuance that you just offered, or that you would want to see. If you want to see that, that's a qualitative kind of research. It's just really hard to do with this kind of work. I hope I didn't sound like too much of a cop-out, but it's just a fact. Yeah, down here at the front.
Thank you very much for this research. Actually, I don't have a question. It's more a comment on the research. It's really interesting in terms of these identity questions. And I really like your two graphics where you shown perception of civil identity and ethnic identity. And I was a little bit surprised first when you show that after full-scale invasion, civil identity becomes stronger but less than ethnical identity. And I started to think why, yeah, we can move back. I think this one, yeah. So yeah, we can see that like ethnic identity impact of the war is higher on the ethnic identity rather than on civic identity. Not much. Everything is marginal, but anyway. And I started to think why it could happen in Ukraine, and I understand that civic identity was already present in among all Ukrainians. It doesn't matter in Kramatorsk, in Kropyvnytsk, Lviv, etc. All people somewhat relate themselves to Ukrainians as a state. But if we are talking about ethnic identity, I suppose that some people in eastern part of Ukraine who had mixed origin, Russian and Ukrainian, started to relate themselves more to Ukrainian rather than to Russian after this full-scale invasion started. So it's a really interesting example how different identity lives inside us and how they work actually. So thank you very much. It's really good. And maybe more question, but not directly about your research. You mentioned different theories of origin, of nation origins. I believe all of them are true, and all of them works at some time. At some time, more important economic reasons. At sometimes some state enforcement, etc. I want to ask you: do you familiar with any research about new identity in countries like African countries that was former colony of European nations? And actually, as far as I know, borders of these countries doesn't necessarily reflect the national borders inside this country. So, do we witness now emergence of new nations like Chadians or maybe like Central Africans or something like that? Thank you.
That's great. The first thing about ethnic versus civic, I just wrote all that down because it's great, and I think you're probably right actually that there's more of a ceiling effect on civic identity than there is on ethnic identity, and so there's more room for movement and more ability to awaken that in some sense. So that's really helpful. In terms of the broader literature on ethnicity, so there has been a fair amount of work over the last 20 years on the relationship between states and ethnic groups in Africa and in different parts of Africa. And what's really interesting is a couple of things. One is all of the research shows very durable identities around tribes that predate the colonial period, that somehow miraculously survive the colonial period. Now, the colonial period is this incredible state-driven process of standardization, right? It's like, okay, you guys all speak a different language. Now you're all speaking French, right? And the tribal languages and tribal identities survive all of that, which is really, really striking. On the other hand, they are also very much shaped by state formation. And they're shaped very clearly by the need within states that bring together lots of different tribal groups. So, boundaries are drawn that sometimes cross the traditional homeland of one group or put together other groups. And what you see is political alliances across tribal groups that are a function of the state that they're in. There's a really good paper by a guy called Dan Posner from the early 2000s, looking at the relationship between different ethnic groups in, Uganda, I believe, and the state next door. And essentially what he shows is that in one of these two states, these two ethnic groups are competitors, and in the other, they're really tight, really close politically. And the reason is that in the state where they're close politically, together they form 60% of the population, and so they can basically exclude everybody else and ensure that all the political spoils run to them. In the other state, they're smaller, and so they have to form alliances with a much broader part, and they're not usually in the winning coalition, and so they have no reason to cooperate, and they compete with one another. And so those pre-existing identities interact really interesting ways with the new, or relatively new political institutions that were established either in the colonial period or in the immediate post-colonial period. But I think the really striking thing is the durability of these identities across what's really an extraordinarily long, violent, and tumultuous period.
Thank you very much.
That's a great question. Great. Well, there's no more questions. Thanks so much, everyone. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. Thank you for the opportunity.